The Naked Truth is a pretty impressive start to the third season of Wings. This is a brilliant season. We have some great episodes coming up, and I really loved revisiting this episode because it really is great. There will be spoilers from now, of course, as I talk about what happens in the episode. I'm not going to go through things in too much detail. I won't go through things chronologically. I'll just talk about the overarching narrative and what happens in this. So as I said, there will be spoilers from now, and this one takes place 10 months after the end of the previous episode, and at the end of that episode, Helen decided to go to New York because she really wants to give her cello career a proper go. She feels like that's the place to be. Unfortunately, as we learn in this episode, things have not actually gone that swimmingly. The only thing I don't buy about this episode is that at the end of the previous episode, Helen and Joe both said, "I love you," before Helen departed. And I was under the impression that they'd at least try and make a long-distance relationship work. And that just didn't happen. Helen just didn't get in touch with Joe. And I'm trying to find a reason for that. And I think it might be because she was embarrassed, because things didn't go the way that she expected they would, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but that's the only reason I can really think of, unless Helen thought Joe might be a distraction. But if she genuinely loved him, which I believed she did, or does, then I don't necessarily believe her actions. But that aside, everything else was great, and it actually starts off at, I think, 3 o'clock in the morning, and Helen is phoning Joe, and Joe answers the phone, obviously very sleepily, and we establish that she hasn't been in touch with him. And Joe's very polite, very nice to her. He's not completely fallen all over her. He's not groveling, begging her to come back and saying, "Let's make it work," or "I'll move to New York, thank you for getting in touch." He's not really engaged in the conversation, but he is pleasant, of course. And we quickly realise why this is the case, because once Joe hangs up, the camera pans, and we see that there's a woman in bed with Joe. And this is a woman called Gail, played by Gretchen German. And Gail is a really, really likeable character. As we get to know her a little bit in this episode, she does come across as really nice. And Joe is asking the others, literally everybody, what he should do. Should he tell Helen about Gail? And I think it's worth clarifying that he and Gail had only been together, I think, 2 months. So I feel like waiting 8 months for Helen to get in touch with him was a reasonable, more than reasonable amount of time, to be fair. And he decides to go to New York with Brian. And we get a couple of scenes in New York. They have an address for Helen because she sent Faye I think it was a birthday card. And they go to this address and they're at a strip club. And they talk to somebody, one of the waitresses there, but we only see her from behind, and then we quickly realise that this is Helen. And this is what her life is now. Clearly her cello career did not take off the way that she'd anticipated. And I feel like she has a mix of emotions here, and I feel like her response is very genuine, and I really like that aspect of it, because on the one hand, she's shocked that they're there. She doesn't necessarily want them to see her working there or in this current situation. But I also think there's an element of relief there as well. Glad that we have familiar faces. And she very quickly agrees to go back to Nantucket with them. And she admits that New York was a terrible experience. She's really glad to be back. It seems like everything is going in the greatest direction possible for her at this time. And then Gail comes in and kisses Joe. And Gail is unaware of what's happening with Helen, so it's not like Gail was doing it to annoy Helen or to get the attention away. I just want to make this clear that Gail comes across as a really likeable character. Maybe a little bit unreasonable in her expectations, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Helen runs through to the office because I think unreasonably, but also understandably, I feel like she felt she could pick things up with Joe where they left off. Understandable to think that because that's kind of what Joe maybe led her to believe by going and ostensibly rescuing her and also not mentioning Gail, but also unreasonable because she hadn't been in touch for a very long time and it's not fair for her to have expected Joe to just hang around waiting for her. So I think her response was very believable, but also not necessarily acceptable. And Gail then comes in and says the others told her about her, she's being really nice to her. she does suggest that they should all hang out sometime, which I think is maybe asking a little bit too much too soon from Helen. So maybe her expectations are a bit too high, but I do like Gail. I think she does come across as a genuinely likeable person. And Helen is completely the unreasonable one here because the episode ends in a way that's, well, it's kind of dramatic and also kind of pathetic, but in a way that's really entertaining. Helen drives her car through the office. Bearing in mind the office is constructed in the middle of the airport, so it's not exactly made from solid walls or anything, but she doesn't go full speed ahead, she just kind of bumps into it a little bit. That's maybe an understatement, but it's not full speed ahead smacking into it. So it's not that dramatic, but also at the same time, nobody expected it. So it was a bit petty and ridiculous of her, and also just kind of pointless. She did it to make herself feel better, but it makes for good television. So we're ending not necessarily on a cliffhanger as such, but certainly it's unclear from this point what Jo and Helen's relationship is going to be like. Obviously, a great way to bring Helen back into the story. The show wouldn't be the same without her. Really great to see her back from New York. And I think it's a very strong start to a pretty exciting season. There are some fun things to come. I'll talk about those in due course. But for now, very happy with The Naked Truth. Definitely a pretty solid way to start season 3 of Wings.